Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Nathan Garland, and I am the current Canadian Water Resources Association Ontario Branch President. The CWRA is fortunate to be able to host this afternoon's webinar with staff from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry on the recently released flood guidance document titled Protecting People and Property, Ontario's Flooding Strategy. I believe you will see or be provided a link in the document as part of the presentation, so please look out for that in the chat panel. A bit about CWRA. CWRA is in its 73rd year of operation as a water organization, and we have provincial branches across the country who organize local workshops and events as well. While I would like to say it's business as usual, we all know this year is challenging with what's occurring locally, nationally, and internationally. This global pandemic has caused us to shift our approach. While we've been disappointed to have to cancel or postpone a number of events, both locally and nationally, we are also challenged and excited to move towards connecting with a more digitally accessible content. So this is one of our opportunities here today. Thank you for those members who continue to support CWRA, and also a big thank you to our presenters at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry for joining us and sharing the results of the Ontario Flooding Strategy. So just before I begin, a couple of housekeeping items. The presentation will be approximately 45 minutes long with some questions and answers at the end. We'll try to keep it to about an hour or so just to be respectful of people's times, but if it goes a little bit over, we might continue on if there are really good questions coming in. Please write your questions during the presentation in the question panel on the side of your screen. There's a dialog box located there. It's either on the right or left-hand side, depending on how you have it located. MNRF staff will be answering those questions after the presentation at the end. So if you have a question on slide 2, maybe please just indicate on the slide as well. The presentation will be recorded and sent out afterwards to all those attending. It will also be posted on the CWR website. During the talk, we'll be posting useful links in the chat window on your right or left-hand side in the discussion panel. If you have any follow-up you'd like to link on there or have questions on that. Finally, as my last housekeeping point, please stay around for the final slide, as the CWRA Ontario branch will be hosting our annual general meeting on Thursday, May 21st in the afternoon. There will be details on that and in a subsequent email sent out to Ontario branch members as well too. So thank you. Today we are joined by several members of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry here to present and discuss the strategy. I'll introduce John Dunaville, who is the Manager of Resource Planning and Development Policy Branch within the Water Resource Division of the MNRF. Thanks, John, and I'll turn it over to you, let you introduce your staff and present.
Thanks, Nathan. We wanted to thank the association for having us here today, and it's a good opportunity to give you all an update on the work that we've been doing over the last year to develop Ontario's flooding strategy. So the ministry has a few folks on the line from our water resources section that was the lead in the policy development on the strategy. So we have Jennifer Mackay, who's our coordinator, and then a few of our senior advisors, including Mike Passy, Alex McLeod, and Danielle McCorkindale. So Mike will be walking through the presentation today, and it really is meant to be an overview of the work that we've done over the last year. Starting obviously with the significant flooding that occurred last year in communities across Ontario, and then through to the development and release of the flooding strategy, which came out in March of 2020. We're looking forward to the discussion after the presentation, and we're hoping for about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&As. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Mike to start the presentation.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. So my name is Mike Passy. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with the Water Resources section at Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And I was one of the staff members who supported the Special Advisor on Flooding in conducting his review of flood mitigation policies and programs in Ontario. And one of the advisors tasked with coordinating the development of Ontario's flooding strategy. So I'm going to walk everybody through a short presentation and then save time at the end for discussion. So as John said, this is really an overview of the flooding strategy and how it's developed. And we will spend some time at the end of the presentation discussing next steps for rolling out the various initiatives that are included within the strategy. So in terms of background, basically in terms of how we got to where we are today, it was almost a year ago today that the province initiated a review of the policies, programs, and initiatives that it provides related to flood mitigation. And as John said, this was really initiated following significant flooding in across Ontario, but particularly in the Muskoka area and along the Ottawa River, particularly in Ottawa and Pembroke, but all the way up further north to North Bay as well. In response to significant flooding in those areas in early May, the province initiated a number of listening sessions with municipal leaders in Muskoka, Pembroke, and Ottawa, where a number of MPPs, including our minister and some other senior cabinet ministers, organized a series of roundtable discussions with municipalities in those areas to understand how they were being impacted by flooding and to seek any advice from those municipalities and other kind of local leaders on what the province could do to try to assist municipalities and local residents in responding to and recovering from flooding that occurred last year and to improve the overall flood mitigation framework in Ontario. In addition to those listening sessions, we also put up an online survey to seek public feedback from a wider range of stakeholders and individuals on Ontario's flood mitigation framework and the various policies and programs that are in place. And all of that work led to the appointment in July of last year of a special advisor on flooding. So Mr. Doug McNeil was appointed by the province as Ontario's special advisor on flooding and was tasked with reviewing all the information that we had collected up to that point through the various listening sessions and an online survey and conducting an independent review of the specific flooding that occurred in May of last year and an overall review of Ontario's policy and program framework. His work extended over roughly 3 months and included literature review, so reviewing background information, again, reviewing the results of the engagement sessions and survey, and conducting a number of community site tours and targeted stakeholder meetings. We did organized a bit of a roadshow as per the special advisor's request, where we started in Ottawa, meeting with municipal leaders and other organizations, toured up the Ottawa River, meeting with various dam owners and individuals who had been impacted by flooding, all the way up to North Bay, back down through Muskokas into Toronto, and then out through Cambridge and London. Bringing in people from Southwest Ontario to come and meet with the special advisor and talk about their experiences with flooding and to provide him with their recommendations on how to improve Ontario's overall framework. So all of that work led to the special advisor issuing a report with 66 recommendations in fall of last year. So we received the special advisor's report at the end of October and then released it publicly on ontario.ca at the end of November. And it's really that work that led to the development of the flooding strategy that we're here to discuss today. The flooding strategy really represents the government's response to the special advisor's review and recommendation, and builds on it and goes beyond the recommendations that he provided. In terms of the review findings, so the findings of the special advisor, because this really did directly inform the development of the strategy, just a couple of things to highlight. The special advisor confirmed that the flooding that we're experiencing is caused by natural events and that there's no signs of human error or neglect, including on behalf of dam owners and operators who are active in the regions of the province where flooding occurred. There was a lot of concern raised locally and criticism in the media where people believed that either dam owners, and particularly along the Ottawa River and in Muskoka, either contributed to the flooding that was experienced or could have done more to reduce the damages associated with the flooding. So part of the special advisor's review was to really kind of dig into some of the operations and operational decisions that were made by dam owners and operators in those regions, to review the choices that they made and the sequence of events that led to the flooding downstream of those facilities. And his report confirmed that based on everything he saw, there was no indication or no signs of neglect or human error as being the cause of flooding. And that after his review, he was convinced that the decisions that operators made and the actions of various agencies to prepare for and to respond to the flooding that occurred really did help to reduce damages. Even as bad as they were, the actions that they took, he believed did help reduce damages that would have otherwise occurred. He also acknowledged that Ontario does have a fairly robust policy and program framework that has gone a long way to reducing damages associated with flooding in Ontario, but acknowledged that the kind of ongoing impacts associated with flooding and the costs that are being incurred as a result of flooding should serve as a constant reminder that there's always room for improvement. There's always more that we can do to try to improve the framework that we have, recognizing that it is a fairly robust and sophisticated framework. He also identified that there's really, in his mind, there's really no magic fix or silver bullet solution. This is really about making incremental improvements to the various programs, policies, and initiatives that the province and other levels of government and organizations have in place to try to further reduce the impacts of flooding, and that we really all have a role to play in trying to reduce the impacts of flooding on Ontarians. So every level of government, be it municipal, provincial, federal, critical partners like conservation authorities, other stakeholders, and environmental and non-government groups, including down to developers and individual homeowners and property owners. Really, everyone has a role to play in trying to reduce the costs and the impacts of flooding in Ontario. So it was really that kind of tone and those high-level findings, in addition to the 66 recommendations that he provided, that really kind of set the groundwork and kind of served as overall direction for pulling together Ontario's flooding strategy. And I see the link to the Special Advisor's report has been provided. If anyone hasn't had a chance to go through it, we recommend you take a look. In terms of developing the strategy itself, once the province received the Special Advisor's report at the end of October, we created two kind of internal teams that were tasked with reviewing the report and recommendations and providing or contributing to the province's response to those recommendations. So we had an ADM or an Assistant Deputy Minister level steering committee with representatives from a range of different ministries who were either directly implicated by recommendations within the Special Advisor's report, or who also had additional programs or policies that they thought could be improved to try to help reduce the impacts of flooding in Ontario. So that team, that steering committee, included representatives from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Environment, Conservation and Parks, Infrastructure, Transportation, Finance, Indigenous Affairs, Government and Consumer Services, Energy, Northern Development and Mines, and Emergency Management Ontario out of the Solicitor General's office. So it really was a kind of broad, quote unquote, all of government approach to reviewing the recommendations from the Special Advisor. And within that theme of we all have a role to play, and this is about finding incremental improvements to all of our programs and services, that kind of commitment from all of those ministries to come to the table to review the recommendations and review their own programs and and policies to identify areas where improvements could be made. So that table operated from late fall of last year until mid-March, so kind of following the release of the strategy, and really provided the overall kind of strategic direction for the strategy's development. Also had an internal inter-ministry working group of about 50 or so people, mostly managers and staff level representatives from those ministries, that really were responsible for the kind of day-to-day heavy lifting in analyzing the recommendations, providing advice back up to that ADM level steering committee, and identifying proposals and commitments that ended up being included within the strategy. In terms of the strategy itself, it was released on March 9th. As I said, it responds to and builds upon the special advisor's recommendations. So as I said, there were a number of additional ministries that kind of hopped on board to help develop the strategy that weren't necessarily discussed within the special advisor's report. They kind of took it as a call to action to step up and identify their own initiatives that could help reduce the impacts of flooding in Ontario. As I said, it involves 10 different ministries, so it really is all of government response and a commitment from all of those various ministries to review and update various policies and programs. The bulk of the commitments, or at least the largest kind of bulk of the commitments within the strategy, do rest with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. I think we have roughly 30%, almost a third of all of the commitments within the strategy are assigned to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to advance, with the remaining kind of 70% being spread out amongst those various ministries that I discussed, with Ministries of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Emergency Management Ontario, Infrastructure, and Environment probably having the kind of second largest bundle of activities that they're responsible for, and those various other ministries either leading, and MTO having a number of commitments in the strategy, and those other ministries that I mentioned either leading specific initiatives or supporting those other ministries in advancing their commitments. So the strategy itself includes over 90 individual initiatives spread across the pillars of emergency management, so in proposed improvements or enhancements to policies and programs focus on prevention and mitigation, preparedness, emergency response, and recovery. So again, it's kind of an acknowledgement back to the special advisor's report that there's this requires incremental improvements to all of these different components across the pillars of emergency management, and it's through improving all of those areas that we hope to reduce the impacts of flooding in Ontario. Various initiatives will be rolled out individually over the next several years, being led by the various ministries that are accountable for those commitments. And then the rest of the presentation really kind of goes through the details of the strategy itself. The front end of the strategy sets an overall framework for guiding ministry initiatives, sets out a series of goals, objectives, and priorities for various ministries to direct their policies and programs towards. So we have 6 goals focused on increasing public health and safety, reducing property and environmental damage, reducing economic loss, social disruption, public and private expenditures, and critical infrastructure disruption as being the kind of overarching goals for the initiatives within this strategy. I have a series of objectives that we're seeking to achieve by implementing the actions within the strategy. So keeping people and property out of high-risk areas, not creating or aggravating existing flood risks, or creating new or aggravating existing flood risks, reducing the impacts of flooding on existing communities, ensuring Ontarians are aware of flood risks and are taking steps to prepare for them, ensuring the efficient and effective services are in place to respond to flood-related emergencies when they occur, and ensuring Ontarians impacted by flooding can get back on their feet as soon as possible. Again, a range of objectives that kind of go across the 5 pillars of emergency management. And then the strategy is divided between 5 different priorities with a series of actions and specific initiatives housed under each of those priorities. The first priority being understanding flood risks, second, strengthening governance, third, enhancing flood preparedness, 4, enhancing flood response, and 5, investing in flood risk reduction. In terms of the actions grouped under priority number 1, understanding flood risks, our goal with these actions is to increase government understanding of flood risks in Ontario, both at the municipal, or at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. We have a number of actions under kind of 2 overarching themes. One focused on enhancing flood mapping, where the province has committed to establishing a multi-agency flood mapping technical team that will assist the province in advancing various programs and policies and guidelines related to flood mapping in Ontario. To develop a multi-year approach to updating flood mapping in Ontario, maintaining flood-related foundational geospatial data, establishing a provincial elevation mapping program, and updating provincial standards for flood mapping. There's also a number of initiatives related to increasing public awareness and education. So these focus on increasing public access to flood-related information and increasing transparency around water management decisions, which was tied back to some of those concerns around the operation of water control facilities in certain areas, that while the special advisor found that there was no evidence to suggest neglect or mismanagement, he did acknowledge that some of those criticisms maybe could potentially be reduced or addressed if there was additional access to information around how water management decisions were being made. Noting that he met with different groups all across the province and found some examples where particularly municipalities, but other local stakeholders had a greater level of involvement or understanding of the decisions that the dam owners and operators were making. So they had a greater level of comfort that reasonable decisions were being made, and they understood the trade-off decisions that were being made by those operators, and those groups seemed to be far less likely to criticize those dam owners and operators for the decisions they made, because they had greater involvement in understanding of those decisions and the limitations of what any individual dam owner or operator could actually do. So he identified that as a model that he thought other dam owners and operators could follow. But the outcome associated with these actions is really to ensure that Ontarians, including municipal and provincial agencies, are aware of flood risks, understand how risk can be mitigated, and understand how risk management decisions are being made. I want to highlight a couple of or a handful of specific initiatives that are grouped under this priority related to flood mapping. So the commitment to establish a multi-agency flood mapping technical team. In reviewing the recommendations from the special advisor, there was kind of the early acknowledgement that a lot of the expertise for flood mapping and the data that is out there exists outside of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and the provincial government. So that we really need to bring together representatives from provincial ministries and the federal government, but also from municipalities, conservation authorities, and academia to help the province fulfill its commitments related to updating floodplain mapping in Ontario. That it's really particularly municipalities, CAs, and academia that really have the technical expertise that's required to really help inform updates to provincial policies, decisions around the collection, consolidation, and use of flood-related information, and the development of a multi-year approach to updating flood mapping. And that's also a commitment in the strategy that we've gotten a lot of interest from people to discuss. The commitment, if you review the strategy, the commitment related to the multi-year approach, it's really an acknowledgement that I think on average, based on some of the information that the special advisor found, he was concerned that the average age of flood mapping in Ontario, and I know this is a concern or a challenge in other jurisdictions as well, but recommended that the province work with various agencies to develop a multi-year approach to filling gaps in flood mapping in Ontario. A lot of us have benefited from recent funding from the federal government into the National Natural Disaster Mitigation Program to update flood mapping, but we acknowledge that there are still a number of gaps across the province. So this multi-year approach really came out of his recommendations, where he advised the province to bring those experts together to evaluate the state of flood mapping in Ontario, identify priority areas for updating or producing new mapping, to determine the costs associated with various technological options for updating mapping, recognizing that we had a fairly wide range of estimates in terms of what it would actually cost to close the gap and update flood mapping in Ontario, to look for opportunities for funding partnerships, and to also look at mechanisms for data sharing, maintenance, and access and distribution, and to provide recommendations for updates to policies, regulations, and legislation that'll help ensure flood mapping information can be shared with other agencies in the public. Again, kind of linking back to his recommendations about trying to make that information as available as possible. We've also acknowledged that the federal government is particularly interested and has shown commitment to updating flood maps all across Canada. In recent mandate letters issued to various ministers at the federal level. So we've committed to work closely with our partners in the federal government to support them in their initiatives and to ensure that the work that we're doing to look at the state of flood mapping in Ontario will support the work that they're doing as well. The second priority area focuses on strengthening governance of flood risks. So the goal here is really for all agencies involved in flood management to work together to minimize the impacts of flooding. And there's kind of two bundles of activities under this, or actions under this priority. The first looking at clarifying roles and responsibilities across various ministries and levels of government, including roles and responsibilities for identifying natural hazards, so identifying the extent of the hazard and conducting some of the mapping work that we talked about on the previous slide, as well as clarifying responsibility for urban flooding within provincial ministries. MNRF is historically had the provincial mandate or overall responsibility for riverine flooding and flooding caused by lake levels and large inland lakes, so Great Lakes and large inland lakes, and have a fairly robust program for that type of flooding, but responsibility for impacts associated with urban flooding is kind of far more diffuse across various ministries. So there was a recommendation that those ministries get together and try to clarify various roles and responsibilities and ensure all the work that we're doing related to urban flooding is well coordinated. There's also a group of commitments around promoting sound land use planning decisions. So the Ministry of Municipal Affairs had committed to and has since already updated the natural hazards policies contained within the provincial policy statement, incorporating some recommendations from the special advisor. We've also committed to updating our existing technical guidelines and reviewing the ideological approaches contained within our natural hazard tech guides. Again, acknowledging that a number of those tech guides are becoming fairly dated, at least in the kind of technical advice and methodologies that they lay out, and are in need of review and update. Number of commitments related to maintaining wetlands and impervious surfaces, led predominantly by MNRF, but also by the Ministry of transportation and environment conservation in parks, enhancing the resiliency of provincial infrastructure and other built form. And again, a lot of the commitments in there relate to the resiliency of provincial infrastructure, like provincial highways, but other infrastructure as well. And a commitment to update existing policy, legislative, and regulatory requirements associated or governing land use planning in Ontario as it relates to flood mitigation. So the outcome associated with these actions is to ensure a consistent application of provincial policy, ensuring that local development is directed away from areas which present unacceptable risk. A couple of things one thing to highlight within this section that I think this audience will be particularly interested in are the commitments related to updating our existing technical guides, so the natural hazard technical guides produced by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So again, the strategy acknowledges that the existing set of guidelines was created between 1996 and 2002. And are in need of update and potentially expansion. We've committed to undertaking a comprehensive review of the natural hazard technical guides with a focus on flooding and erosion. And the strategy includes commitments to examine existing flood level values for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River and connecting channels, evaluate the hazard methodologies for shoreline erosion along the Great Lakes, evaluate our riverine flood standards, particularly relative to their sensitivity to be affected by climate change. So how do we consider climate change in the development and application of our riverine flood standards? Evaluating the hydrologic and hydraulic methodologies included in the technical guides, assessing existing policies and approaches. So the technical guides really kind of lay out the policy framework for land use decisions. So there's a commitment in the strategy to look at some of those existing policies and approaches. Reviewing and recommending updates to any guidance associated with the technical guides, and also evaluating our existing special policy area policies and procedures as they're a component of the technical guide as well. And where appropriate, proceeding with updates to those items. For priority number 3, it's focused on enhancing flood preparedness. So our goal here is for Ontarians to have access to current and timely information in order to prepare for flood events. The actions in this part of the strategy really focus on the provincial flood forecasting and warning system managed and led by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, as well as some monitoring and warning systems managed by the Ministry of Transportation that inform the road weather information system. So there's commitments within the strategy to the commitment to maintain our existing flood forecasting and warning network in partnership with the federal government, to look at opportunities to enhance flood forecasting and warning. So as we're able to undertake a review of the location of our existing gauges, to look at opportunities to enhance that existing system where possible through the use of new technology, automated alarms, those sorts of interventions. To enhance the science and research work that we do that helps to inform the reliability of our flood forecasting and warning system. And there's a number of commitments within the strategy related to that item. Looking at enhancing our use of satellite imagery to inform our flood forecasting and warning system, and commitments from the Ministry of Transportation to maintain Ontario's road weather information system. And again, all of these commitments are fleshed out in more detail within the strategy itself. But the outcome for these actions under this priority is for increased preparedness for future flood events. For priority 4, enhance response and recovery. So our goal here is for emergency response and recovery programs to be well coordinated and effective in supporting communities and Ontarians in their time of need. So the majority of these actions and initiatives are led by Emergency Management Ontario out of the Solicitor General's office, and Municipal Affairs and Housing, who's the provincial lead for municipal and private disaster recovery assistance programs. So Emergency Management Ontario has outlined a number of actions and commitments that they are making under the heading of enhancing emergency response. They've identified a number of ways that they think that they can improve the way that they work with municipalities to accept and process and respond to municipal requests for assistance, and to ensure that those municipalities are well supported in local emergency response. And the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing has made a number of commitments associated with reviewing the results of the Municipal Disaster Recovery Assistance Program enhancements. For those that don't know, in response to the flooding last year in May, this disaster recovery assistance program for municipalities was enhanced as a pilot program, where additional funding was provided back to municipalities to kind of build back better. So if a flood event occurred and washed out a municipal roadway or bridge or other infrastructure, previously, the Disaster Recovery Assistance Program only provided those municipalities with the funding they required to build that piece of infrastructure back to its previous design, whereas they enhanced that program last year to provide additional funding back to those municipalities so that when they rebuild that infrastructure, they can make it more resilient to flooding in the future. So instead of putting the road back at the same elevation, raise it to a higher elevation. So if a similar flood event occurs, you're not going to lose the road again. So Municipal Affairs and Housing was the lead for that program, and they've committed to conducting a review of the results of that pilot. We're also committed to reviewing the Disaster Recovery Assistance for Ontarians program. So this is the Disaster Recovery Assistance program that is available to individual homeowners, property owners, small businesses, ENGOs, and other groups that experience losses as a result of flooding. So there's a commitment to review some of the information and materials and criteria associated with that program, and to support the development of federal flood insurance and relocation programs. And again, these are federal commitments made by or that have been tasked to a number of federal departments, where they've committed to working with the insurance industry and provinces and other groups to develop a cost-effective flood insurance program for Canadians, including looking at the potential for relocation programs. There are some models, including a recent model that was developed in Quebec that looks at tying disaster recovery assistance to relocation programs. So again, the same kind of concept that informed the Build Back Better pilot, the idea that instead of providing people with funding to rebuild in the same location, depending on the level of losses and the level of risk that occurs in that location, there would be additional or separate funding to relocate those homes or businesses out of the floodplain or out of high-risk areas. So that's something that a number of ministries, including Municipal Affairs and ourselves, have committed to supporting the federal government in advancing. And the outcome here is for Ontarians to receive the support that they need to respond to and recover from flood emergencies. The last priority, number 5, is focusing on investing in flood risk reduction. So ensuring that financial investments are available to reduce flood risk, and that those programs are strategic and collaborative. So the strategy commits to maintaining a number of existing infrastructure funding programs, and working with the federal government to explore creating new or additional programs, or extending previous programs, or creating new programs. So it talks about continuing the Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, and commitments from Ministry of Infrastructure to work with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to develop an upcoming stream of that fund focused on funding for disaster mitigation. Commitments to continue the water and erosion control infrastructure program, and program funding being provided to conservation authorities for maintaining their infrastructure and for providing core flood-related activities. Commitments to support federal efforts to launch a new call for proposals under the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and encouraging the federal government to extend the National Disaster Mitigation Program, or to develop a successor program to continue to provide funding for updating flood mapping in Ontario. And a final commitment to ensure municipalities are aware of some of the mechanisms that they have available to them to help finance shoreline protection works. This was an area that was discussed by the special advisor as well. And the outcome here is for flood protection and mitigation works and activities to be appropriately funded. Well, in terms of next steps, we're currently, us as well as the various other ministries that were involved in developing this strategy, we're currently kind of doing some outreach and promotion with various organizations and partners and other levels of government to discuss the strategy and the commitments that it includes, and to help inform priority areas for moving forward in the short, medium, and long term. There's an acknowledgement in the special advisor's report and in the strategy that we won't be able to do everything all at once, and that some of the commitments or actions within the strategy are maybe shorter term initiatives that can build on existing programs and can be rolled out relatively quickly, whereas there are other commitments that will take much longer to develop and to roll out. But that the various initiatives within the strategy are really being led by the various ministries. So that kind of group of 10 ministries that are responsible for the various commitments in the strategy. We're continuing to coordinate amongst ourselves in terms of keeping track of initiatives and how they're moving forward. But really depending on the commitment, it'll be up to that individual ministry who's responsible for that program or policy to advance the commitments they've made in the strategy as they can. And I think there's a bit of a discussion of this at the beginning of the call. I think we all recognize that the current situation with COVID has really kind of disrupted our kind of typical day-to-day business. Typically at this point of the year, we would be a little further along in understanding our budget for this year or for the next couple of years, and in identifying the priorities that we're going to advance in the next year or in the next 2 years. But with everything going on, the provincial budget has been delayed. The kind of internal work planning process that ministries usually go through based on the budget that they've been given has been delayed. So that has put off our timelines for starting to roll out various initiatives in the strategy. It's kind of put them back by a couple of months at this point. But we are working internally to try to plan out which initiatives we can move forward with in the short term, doing a bunch of the background work, again, reaching out to other stakeholders and organizations to discuss the strategy and to try to identify opportunities for partnerships. Similar to the statement I made around flood mapping, a lot of the expertise in a number of these areas exists outside of the provincial government. There's a number of agencies, I'm sure, people that are represented on the call today that have done a lot of work in a lot of these areas, that have been very gracious in coming forward and making commitments to support MNRF and other ministries in advancing some of the commitments that they've made within the strategy. We've been in contact with Conservation Ontario and a number of CAs who again have been very willing to kind of step up and identify areas or wishing to discuss areas where they can provide support to the ministry and help do some of the heavy lifting associated with advancing these priorities. Again, kind of going back to that recognition that we all have a role to play in trying to reduce the impacts of flooding on Ontarians. That's the end of the presentation. So I'll put it back to John or the organizers to facilitate the question and answers.
Thank you, Mike. I'll get started by reading a few of the questions that we have come in already. We have some questions from Christine. What are the timelines for these actions? Will there be funding commitments for these actions in the provincial budget? And does MNRF have the staff and resources needed to carry out these updates in a timely way, like within 3 years?
Thanks, Meg, and thanks, Christine. It's John here, and I'll start maybe talking a little bit about the funding and the resources in place, and then Mike, I'll let you speak to the timelines for the various actions. So there's obviously a tremendous amount of interest and support at the province for the flooding strategy. The Premier and various ministers saw firsthand last year the devastating impacts that flooding can have on people around the province and communities around the province. I think there's other evidence for that support in the fact that, as Mike highlighted in the presentation, 10 different ministries came forward to insert actions into this flooding strategy, which really, as Mike said, represents really an all-of-government response from an Ontario perspective. So we were very pleased with that. Mike mentioned near the end of the presentation that because of the current health crisis and state of emergency that the Ontario budget has been delayed. The budget was to be introduced at the end of March, but it has been delayed indefinitely right now. So I unfortunately can't answer your specific question about funding commitments included in the budget. However, I can say that there continues to be a tremendous amount of support for our work and interest in our work, especially as we approach the spring flooding season, or in the spring flooding season. So we'll have to keep you posted on that one. And I don't know, Mike, if you want to talk about timelines.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of hard to, because of the number of initiatives in the strategy. It's hard to talk generally about the timelines for all of them. As I mentioned, like the updates, there are commitments in the strategy, such as updating the natural hazard portion of the provincial policy statement that have already been completed. And kind of at the other end of the spectrum, there was recommendations from the special advisor to consider new regulatory or legislative authority, or to develop new programs that don't currently exist at the provincial level, that just based on how legislation is developed and how programs are developed would take considerably more time. And so it's the strategy itself will have a range of those initiatives. I know, like for the ministry, and this will be true for other ministries, there will be things for each ministry that are a higher priority in the short and medium term than others. That's part of the reason why we highlighted some of the work around flood mapping. And there is so much work being done right now with the federal government and other ministries around flood mapping that we know that that will be a high priority area for our ministry and a number of other ministries. But again, there could be a considerable amount of work associated with fulfilling some of those commitments. So it's hard to talk too generally around the timelines. But if there are specific commitments within the strategy that you want to talk about in a little more detail, we can try to respond to more specific questions.
Thank you, Mike. The next question is from Ron. Will updates to the technical guidelines consider or maybe even adopt the approaches to regulatory flood controls discussion paper that Conservation Ontario wrote in 2016 or 2017?
So thanks for that, Ron. And I'll start off again, and Mike, feel free to jump in. So as folks on the line who are familiar with the tech guides know, there are a tremendous amount of information, and they haven't been updated in many years. In that span of time, a variety of folks have done work or made suggestions as to how those guides or specific components of those guidelines could be updated to reflect either new science or new developments in the world or the industry. So we'll consider a variety of factors as we update them, and we would work very closely with some of our key partners, and that would obviously include groups like Conservation Ontario and the conservation authorities directly. I don't know, Mike, if you had any other thoughts on that.
No, I was going to say the same thing. Like in our recent discussions with Conservation Ontario, that's an area where they identified the work that TRCA and others have done. Again, as a starting point for us to look at or to work with the folks that help put some of that together to try to advance those commitments. And again, we're very happy to have people identify partnerships like that, but it's kind of too early to speculate which aspects or how that work will inform updates to the provincial guidelines.
Thank you. The next question is from Neil. What did the special advisor recommend with respect to increased proposals for structural measures, e.g. dikes, to mitigate flood risks for developed and developing areas? And he gives an example. In BC, the province administers over 1,000 kilometers of flood protection dikes owned and maintained by more than 100 local diking authorities.
And so, John, I can start with that one. The special advisor didn't make any recommendations for the province to any specific recommendations for the province to build additional control structures in any given area. There were a couple of recommendations in his report for the province to look at updating some of our technical standards and B, to review some of our policies and approaches related to the use of structural measures, and to kind of make a decision around whether certain structures should be regulated by the province, or whether the province should have a more active role in either providing guidance on the use of structural measures or regulating certain structures such as regional flood control facilities. So there is some discussion of that in the special advisor's report, but I can't think of any recommendations pointing to the province or municipalities or any other level of government to build specific structures in specific areas. There are a couple of areas where he talked about the use of those types of measures, and in areas where he thinks the province should either review or update its existing policies or requirements. But again, the recommendations would kind of be at that level.
Thank you. And then we have another question on structural measures from Harshad. Any thoughts on working with other ministries to remove existing undersized infrastructure, say under Highway 401 in this program?
So that's a great question, Harshad. And so as Mike highlighted, there's 10 different ministries that have contributed actions in the strategy. So while our ministry was the lead, we unfortunately can't claim to be the sole experts on every single action or results, or what could be the on-the-ground results of the various actions. So your suggestion and questions are a really good one, and we're happy to forward that on to our colleagues at the Ministry of Transportation to make them aware of it as well.
Thanks, John. Next question is from Rahana. Recognizing that the strategy is meant to be high level and that there are 90 activities that have been outlined in it, Will there be further detailed documents released on those 90 activities that include roles and responsibilities and timelines?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the activity, and in some cases, some of the commitments would require, for example, further public consultation or the development of guidelines or revision to guidelines, as we referenced in an earlier discussion. So for some of them, there will be, I think, more put out on them and more explanation and even more opportunities for public input, including obviously input from our partners like municipalities and conservation authorities. And then for others, just because they are more straightforward or simpler, we may simply just move forward with them. So it's a real mixed bag in the strategy in terms of the variety of activities.
Thank you. The next question is from Courtney. In priority number 4, enhanced response and recovery, there was a mention of a model out of Quebec that links disaster recovery assistance to relocation. Where can we find out more about this model?
That's a great question. So, Mike, I don't know if you have any information on the Quebec government's approach to relocation.
Probably not in the level of detail, I don't know enough about it to speak to it confidently. But we can, I'm sure there's a way that we can work with Meg and Nathan to facilitate this. If we can find some sources that we could direct the person that asked the question to, we should be able to get you some links or supporting material that would explain the type of program that Quebec has in place. We also have collected some information on other models in place. There are some models looking at relocation programs or buyout programs that we've found in various US states that we could try to provide you some information on if there's a way for us to do that. And otherwise, you know, the person that asked the question, they can email John or I directly, and we can connect back with them that way.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And just as a note, we are going to be posting this presentation on the CWRA website, as well as the slides. So there will be an opportunity to go back to those slides that we have and see kind of maybe more information like that. The next question we have from Kate: what is the role of the individual upper and lower tier municipalities to implementing these actions? And where will municipalities lead versus waiting for provincial direction?
That's a great question. With 90 actions, it's hard to necessarily comment on each one and how municipalities may or may not have a role there. I can say that we did have some conversations with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario around the flooding strategy, and we are looking forward to working closely with our partners in the municipal sector to implement these actions. There's a few of them where, as we reference further, things like natural hazard technical guidance that supports the planning system in Ontario. That's something where the province would want to do some work and engage with municipalities to learn from their on-the-ground experiences and try to reflect that in the provincial direction. But obviously, there are some cases where the provincial direction, for example, on planning, then needs to translate down into municipal decision-making with regard to actual development and site considerations. So we see it as a partnership, and it will depend on what action you're specifically interested in.
Thank you. And then a question from Marc Andre: what gap or role do you see remote sensing would fill in the wider flood mitigation strategy?
Thanks a lot, Marc Andre. So I think Mike and I would both admit to being a bit of policy wonks and not necessarily remote sensing experts. So there are a few references in the strategy to ensuring that we're using updated technology and we're using updated science in some of our work, but I can't speak necessarily specifically to remote sensing itself. I don't know, Mike, if you had any thoughts on that.
No, there are commitments in that part of the strategy to look at like opportunities to incorporate satellite imagery, remote sensing, incorporate it more into our flood forecasting and warning system. And as John said, there's another part of our ministry that's responsible for that. And there's a chance some of those people are on this call and will call me up later to say I butchered explaining how those commitments will work if I actually tried to get into the details. But our again, there's some work being done by the federal government to kind of expand or give additional access to remote sensing data that we think that we might be able to use to help inform or enhance our flood forecasting and warning system. We have some expertise in the ministry around using satellite imagery and remote sensing for forestry or other parts of our ministry's programs that we think we can maybe learn from and incorporate into our flood mitigation and preparedness program. But again, as John said, we're not necessarily the right people to talk about the technical details of those commitments.
Thank you. The next question is from Catherine. How is land cover and vegetation being considered in prevention? So wetland and natural areas monitoring, conservation and restoration, for instance.
That's a great question, Catherine. And so a lot of what you're talking about is considered in the current planning framework in Ontario. And so it's considered when, with regard to the provincial policy statement, which directs municipalities or provides some direction to municipalities in terms of development approvals in natural heritage features. We also have a system of conservation authorities, and 36 of them in Ontario, which issue development permits in floodplains and water courses and around wetlands. And so those are also, those kind of things are considered to some degree in the development and planning framework in the province. I probably butchered that a little bit. So Mike, if you have any extra thoughts, please chime in.
Well, and there's a number of commitments in the strategy that essentially try to or commit to trying to answer like that question, and looking at developing new policies. I don't know.
Hi, Mike, are you still there?
Might have lost Mike.
That's okay. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question really quick, and when we get Mike back, he might be able to finish his sentence. Another question from Rahana. With respect to slide 14, given the current economic climate, is the province liaising with the federal government to look at alternative cost-sharing formulas for the next DMAF intakes, i.e. maybe a higher federal share?
So as Mike mentioned, priority 5 of the flooding strategy talks about investing in flood reduction, flood risk reduction, and it acknowledges the important role that the federal government has played over many years, from programs like FDRP and NDMP and DMAF itself as well. And the tone has meant that the province wants to work strategically and collaboratively with the federal government on those programs to ensure that Ontario's interests and the interests of our communities are reflected. So while I won't discuss the specifics of our discussions with the federal government, we are actively engaged at the table, yes.
Thank you. And the next question is from Sandra and related to that. First, she says, thank you for the presentation, and then asks, there is an overlap with the guidelines and work being prepared by the federal government. So do you see Ontario waiting until that federal work is done to review the technical guidelines?
Not necessarily. So we do have representatives on that federal work, and we're looking forward to working with the federal government. However, the tech guides in Ontario predate the work of the federal government in this area. And we don't see why we would wait necessarily on that that work. If we can do some things provincially that can actually advance the situation in Ontario and actually provide as a bit of an example to the federal work as well.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Gautam. Do you have any program for spring emergency flood management along Lake Ontario?
It's a very, very timely question. So obviously the Great Lake water levels are very high at this time, and is a big concern for a number of municipalities and residents along the shorelines of the Great Lakes and Lake Ontario as an example of that. So we're continuing to work closely with the federal government and with the International Joint Commission to provide Ontario input into their work and then working with our local partners to help with things like disaster prevention and mitigation.
Thank you. And I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then I'll put up the slide on the Ontario branch AGM. So the next question is from Ken. Based on the plans for updated flood mapping, it is likely that many communities will have past development that might be identified as being vulnerable to flooding now. Does the province anticipate a significant increase in the establishment of new special policy areas?
That's a great question, Ken. And for the benefit of folks on the phone, a special policy area is a term used in Ontario for historical areas of development that may exist in floodplains or other hazardous lands. So that's a great question and something we've actually been thinking about over time, and we've done some jurisdictional scanning on how you deal with those situations in other jurisdictions as well. So folks that have developed and find themselves within the floodplain. And so we don't have a concrete answer, but it's possible that there's a variety of techniques out there that could be used to address that.
Thank you. And then I think this is our last question. Are there metrics for assessing the success of the strategy over the coming years?
That's a great question. And so Mike mentioned that that we were going to be having sort of a short, medium, long-term priorities and various timelines associated with those commitments. Our ministry has a variety of public reporting requirements, and as well, given the interest in this file with both our Auditor General and other members of the legislature, I expect that you'll be seeing more regular updates on the results of the strategy over time. And in fact, MNRF put out a few things before this flooding season about improvements we've made since last. And like, for instance, updating our website with better information on how to prevent flooding and respond during floods, as well as key contacts for folks. So we're going to take these incremental steps, and we'll be reporting sort of annually, probably at least, to let people know how we've been doing on implementation.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, Meg, I think that's the end of the questions, but I greatly appreciate this opportunity and wanted to thank the association again for having us. And we at the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry would be happy to talk to any of the members if they have any additional questions.
Hi, John. Thanks very much for presenting today and making your staff available. And Mike, thank you very much for presenting today too as well. I'm actually going to apologize. I forgot to introduce Meg Olson, who's our communication manager, who was facilitating and managing those questions. So thanks, Meg, too, for that. Finally, on the slide, you'll see the last slide to save the date for the upcoming CBRA Ontario Branch annual general meeting held on the afternoon. We haven't quite finalized the time for Thursday, May the 21st. There will be a presentation prior to the AGM, so stay tuned from that on the New Hamburg flood mitigation study. Members will receive a further email introduction with a link to the register for the AGM. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending.